Can everyone hear me?
What?
Yeah, I don't do microphones, amongst other things. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the floor. The first thing that I'd like to state is that it feels to me as though the proposition side are trying to eat the cake and leave it whole. Because on the one hand they tell us, well, we are willing to do anything. We will beat Roy up. We will torture people. But we're not going to undermine bodily autonomy because we think nobody will ever be happy if we do that. I can't quite understand why all the examples they gave us, they then said will never ever happen. If this is the case, I'm not sure what changes under their policy. Except for, oh yeah, we scrapped democracy. I'll talk about that in a second. The second thing that I'd like to say is that I'd love to hear a second proposition explain to us why they think we will still maintain environmental policies when Roy specifically told us that they do not care about the interests of future generations. They do not care about anyone that is not currently living. We believe that they cannot say everything that is important will stay under this model, yet the status quo is somehow not good enough. We would really love to hear what changes. I'm going to have 3 points of rebuttal, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about minorities. So the first thing that I'd like to say is that Loïc came here and sort of tried to give us the model. He said, yeah, we're only talking about current citizens. This basically means no environmental policies, no pensions, actually no long-term planning. Because any citizen that leaves today would prefer the government to invest its resources in them and their lifelong horizon, rather than say, well, we need to build this road so that it lasts 200 years. I don't care about what will happen in 200 years. I won't be more happy than that. This means we're not going to have any long-term planning. Secondly, what he told us, people will decide what is happiness for them. How does that mechanism work? Do we have a referendum on each and every policy that we want to do, whereby people express what will make them happy? How does that even work? We think that it seems logical to assume that the government would have to somehow translate what the people express as their happiness into a policy. Derek already told you, governments are pretty bad at that already today. This is part of why we deposit that in the hands of the courts. We'd love first proposition to have told us, how does it work when everyone decides what makes them happy and then somehow something happens in the real world? Boy, the government. Lastly, what he told us, well, we won't violate many rights because, you know, we also take the extent that you are heard. Mr. Speaker, if it makes enough people happy for me to keep Eli like now, that is justified. Therefore, we believe enough people in this room are going to be happy after this first proposition if I do that now. Therefore, we will harm bodily autonomy. We will harm other basic rights. Second point, Lee talked us about the individual versus society. He admitted himself that today we protect the most important rights. They claim that they're taking every individual into account, and therefore that's fair. Madam Speaker, they are not taking individuals into account. They are taking numbers. I will fill in a number in a survey saying, this will make me 4 happy. And all that I mean to the society as a whole is that number. They don't take into account who I am. This means that we are unable to protect the most vulnerable segments of our society. For example, handicapped people, for example, people with disabilities, people with mental problems, minorities. All those groups are not going to be taken more into account because they're more vulnerable and more prone for abuse. Because all that you matter is that number. We think they're not taking individuals into account. They're making an aggregate of numbers, and we think that that is bad in and of itself. What he told us, well, everyone will be happy because of it, because they will feel that everyone else will do it. When has that ever worked? When were you happy to pay taxes because you said, well, everyone else have to do it, so yeah. That doesn't make people happy, that doesn't make them feel more comfortable, and especially not when it violates your most basic rights. Lastly, we say, and that is the most important thing, and this is where I'm going to set the line in this debate. Madam Speaker, we think we are actually the sensible side of this debate because we want to have both. We think that democracy generally guarantees the fact that you try to cater to the happiness of the most people. We think that while it's true that you vote on a multiple of issues, you actually choose the one that is most important to you, which means that we take into account what factors most to you, and what you wanted that to be part of their logical of how do we assess the happiness. So we think that works today. We think on the other hand, democracy protects basic rights. So we strike this nice balance. They can't argue we are for happiness, they're for oppression. We are also for happiness, but we think that happiness needs to take other things into account. This is where we draw the line. They have to defend happiness as the only metric whatsoever. And with that, I shall move into my substantive. Yes?
I'm going to ignore everything you misread over there, but in today's world, we are shouting equality but achieving nothing. In ours, equality is actually being taken care into account.
How on earth are you taking equality into account unless you assume that equality makes people happy? Look at communism and tell me that equality makes people happy. I don't think that works. I think someone needs to prove that link. So, minorities. First thing I'm going to say very, very simply, they're the most vulnerable group of our society. They're marginalized, they're quite often poor, and most importantly, they always lose in the democratic game. This means that we have to ignore the numbers grid game in order to protect them. We have to take into account other metrics other than the numbers game. What we tell you is that when you try to maximize the total happiness, because you don't take individuals into account, as I've said in my rebuttal, what you do is you just take total of numbers. No, thank you. What you just do is you just take total numbers. This means that the interests of minority groups, and we're not just talking about cultural minorities, we're also talking, like I said, about handicapped people, about people with mental problems and things like that. What we tell you is that you're not going to be able to take their rights into account. What we tell you is that that would mean less protection of their rights. Kieran said, oh, we can still protect minorities because everyone is happy by that. But what we tell you is, again, they can't eat the cake and have it whole. What we tell you is that if the vast majority of society would rather the government invest money in the overall school system, then nobody's going to pay for a school in Arabic in London, because that just wouldn't justify under the metric of the most happiness for the whole of the society. What we tell you is that that would mean that we will get less resources allocated to them. So less mosques, less schools, less protection of languages. And what we tell you, Madam Speaker, is that will necessarily lead to the fact that they will lose their identity and they will lose their happiness. Now, they cared a lot about happiness, but only if you're part of the majority group. We tell you, we think that while we don't get the most happiness for the majority group, we get a lot of happiness for a lot of the groups. We are for Maximin, as what he said in his general Rawlsian assumption. We think that for the most vulnerable people in society, we do owe a special obligation to protect them. Number one, because we are in part very often responsible for the fact that they are the most vulnerable in our society. And number two, because we think that the extent of rights matters no less than the numbers. So at the end of the day, Madam Speaker, we've told you, number one, we got no definitions, no explanations, and actually no ability how this is going to work in ways that will basically change democracy. We told you that it harms individual rights and minority rights. We beg to oppose.
Thank you very much. Let's speak to go to the second half of this debate, and I'd like to put the member of government to open their case.
Mr. Speaker, what the debate's been so far is each side cherry-picking examples that suit their own case and their own policy. What we're going to do at Extension is show you why the best policies are most likely to occur under our plan and answer the major questions that the opposition have levelled at the government team about how and why government can and should measure happiness and whether or not it's going to harm minorities and those who are at risk within democracy. Most of my rebuttal will be integrated into my extension, but I just want to ask one question before I get into that. Is the status quo sufficient? Because what we heard from the opening of is that, we sit somewhere between communism and capitalism right now. We've got a minimum standard that no one falls below. Mr. Speaker, we would firstly say this is an absolute fallacy. Right now in our society, there is huge inequality, a number of people that live at the fringes without any kind of adequate minimum standard and any type of measures that serve to protect their happiness and protect their utility. We would say that our model is most likely to assist those individuals on the fringes, because of an understanding of utility. It isn't simply a numbers, but understanding about marginal utility, that protecting those individuals at the fringes is most likely to contribute to net happiness for society. And we question, Mr. Speaker, exactly how an election serves to protect the rights of minorities and the most vulnerable people in society. We know there is a serious democratic deficit under the status quo, but people with disabilities, people with mental illnesses aren't at the forefront of elections. They don't have the numbers to make sure that their policies and their views are heard. We think elections are fought on a number of issues, and the most vulnerable people simply don't have the ability to get their voices heard. So let's turn now to our extension. We want to ask first, how does government measure happiness? Because there was a real, the opening opposition in today's debate just didn't have an understanding and conception of how government has the capacity to do this. So We understand, Mr. Speaker, that the government doesn't have the ability to understand exactly what each individual wants and achieve that for them to make sure they get that new handbag or their job they really like. That's not the role of government. So how does government measure happiness, no thank you, and seek to provide this utility for each individual? They seek to maximise opportunity and maximise potential horizons for each individual. That means that each person has the widest possible range of options to them as a result of actions that government has taken. It means they have the ability, Mr. Speaker, to be able to manifest their own happiness and version of what their best life is. So what does this look like? Like our opening said, this looks like government funding for healthcare or education or redistributive tax policy. And to the extent that we do these things now, we think we should absolutely do it more. And what we heard from opening up is that we just can't do it. There isn't a way of doing it at the moment. You know, you're going to need a referendum on every single policy. Well, there is, Mr. Speaker. We currently have a happiness index which has an objective criteria about what happiness means to each individual. It's things like infant mortality. It's about how long you are likely to live. It's about gender inequality in your society, not just now. We think there is an objective way to measure happiness and government has the capacity to do so. No thank you. And what we heard from opening opposition was this kind of shopping list of things that this government is never going to have the capacity to do, with absolutely no analysis of why this wouldn't lead to utility. They said, you're not going to have any pensions because that's about the future. We would say for an individual in the short term, knowing that you are going to have a secure retirement and don't have to work for the rest of your life until you die, that's going to help maximise utility because you can plan for retirement and know you're going to have some kind of safety and security. Environmental policy, for example, that isn't just about the long term, it's about the short term, making sure you have clean air, you have water, and you're able to have a productive society. We're not suggesting a huge reduction in autonomy, Mr. Speaker. We think that's unlikely, yes.
While this completely new model is lovely, could you please tell us why do you think the government has a right to tell people what measures their happiness? Because you set a set of criteria that isn't necessarily what the people think is happiness.
Okay, there are two questions in there. Firstly, we resent the assumption this is a new model. I just named the exact same things that our opening government named. Secondly, we don't think that this is a government telling people what to do. It's about maximising opportunity. Having healthcare so that you're alive, having education so you can read and write, allows people to be able to go and do whatever the hell they want with their lives. It's not about the government saying this is what happiness means. It's saying we're going to maximise opportunity for you, and happiness index reflects that, Mr. Speaker. We would say fundamentally that what we have right now is better than anything that the opposition is presenting. And this is again part of our extension, new material about why we don't think we can rely on the status quo. We don't think it's good enough to rely on economic incentives because they're unlikely to take into account minorities, and they're unlikely to mean a government is going to act on the environment because that's not good economic policy. It's simply good short-term and long-term planning. Economic incentives aren't enough to make sure these happiness measures are going to be met because the opposition is wrong. Democracy isn't enough. We would say that government priorities can be skewed by all kinds of different power imbalances that exist under the status quo. These are things like the power of donors and lobbyists, like the fact that different politicians can be beholden to different groups in society, different races, different genders, core constituencies that absolutely skew democratic priorities away from happiness. We would say there is definitely an incentive for politicians to cater to their own interests and the interests of their party, which changes the calculation in terms of how they act and how they seek to make sure that people have enough net happiness. What I want to do next is explain how a model for measuring net happiness actually leads to better protection of minorities and vulnerable groups, answering a key question of the opposition and extending our material. We would say that the opposition has presented a very strict and quite basic understanding of utilitarianism. If they'd gone to maybe that second year course instead of the first year course, it's not just about net happiness and the sheer number of people and the outcomes that flow. There is a concept called marginal utility, and we're going to explain that for you now. Hold on. We would say that government measurement of happiness isn't just about sheer numbers and the best outcome for the majority of people. There is an understanding that policies can affect different actors in different ways. So, for example, someone with a disability not having funding for their wheelchair, the huge deprivation and loss of freedom and loss of happiness of that individual outweighs, let's say, a person in society having to pay $20 extra in taxes to help provide that. Happiness and the impact of government policy affects different actors differently. We would say that means the government has an incentive to do things like make sure that disabilities and mental illness treatment is funded. They're going to do things like protect minority languages, and they're going to do things like radically redistribute wealth, because that means that the poorest people who will have that benefit get maximised utility, even if it leads to slightly less happiness for the richest people. We would say our model is much more likely to make sure people on the fringes are protected, while your model democratic accountability does absolutely nothing. But secondly, we would say this is definitely in government interest, because government doesn't have an interest in inequality within its society, because all those things that occur lead to decrease in happiness, increased crime, talking about increased fracturing within that society. We would say that measuring happiness and quality of life is in government interest. Mr. Speaker, today we firstly explained exactly what the role of government is in measuring utility in terms of making sure each individual has the best opportunity in life. We explained to you why the status quo has a democratic deficit that can't be fixed right now, and how our model in terms of marginal utility makes sure people on the fringes are protected.